and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be going over all of the books that I read in December. So I was able to read 11 books in the month of December. I had a really great reading month. No, it's 12 books. I was able to read 12 books in the month of December. And I had a really great reading month, and the 12 books in the month of December brings me to 125 total books for the year. So here is everything that I read in December. The first book that I read in December was The September House by Carrisa Orlando. I thoroughly enjoyed that, and the longer it's been since I've read it, the more that I really like the book. I listened to the audiobook, and this is one where I would really recommend the audiobook because the narration is just spectacular. It's so funny in the beginning, and then it slowly, like the story slowly starts to unravel. And I just really, really liked it. It was a really great way to frame kind of a spooky, scary paranormal story. In The September House, we follow our main character, Margaret. She is married to her husband. Their daughter has grown up and moved away, and they find a Victorian house for sale, and it is in their price range. They've always wanted to buy a home, and this one seems too good to be true. And so they buy it, and they've lived there for several years, and every September, things get wild. But Margaret is absolutely determined to stay in her dream home. At the beginning of the story, we find out that Catherine, Margaret's daughter, has been calling and has been wanting to talk to her dad because they don't talk very often, and she hasn't heard from him in over a month. And Margaret lets it slip that her dad has been missing for a couple weeks. Catherine comes home to help find her dad, Hal. And so that is what kind of kicks off the beginning of this story. It was just a really great book, and again, the audiobook is excellent, and I really recommend the audiobook. The next book that I read was The Untold story by Genevieve Cogman. This is the 8th and final book in the Invisible Library series. I started the Invisible Library series in January, and I read all 8 books this year. I really enjoyed the Invisible Library series. In this series, we follow Irene, a librarian, to this magical library where she goes to alternate universes and picks up, steals, buys whatever means necessary, gets rare books and special copies of books to bring back to the library, and it's to kind of strengthen the connection between the library and that world. And so there's a lot of shenanigans. There's a big overarching plot, but each book has its own kind of thing going on. I loved the characters. I will say, though, that these books are very formulaic. They follow a formula for each book, and to be honest, I didn't mind that. I took about a month. I read about one a month, and it was just a really nice break to have something where, like, I loved the characters. I really enjoyed the world. It was kind of chaos magic. At one point in the first book, there's like kind of half sentient alligators that are also sort of robots who are attacking people. It's wild. It's absolutely wild, but I really enjoyed those books. I enjoyed the characters, and I liked the formulaicness of those books, and it was just a really nice palate cleanser in between like kind of unknown books where I wasn't sure if I was going to like it, or higher fantasies. It was nice to kind of get to read something that I know the characters, I love the characters, and I know kind of what's going to go down. I will say that I don't think that this series is for everyone. It's sort of spy-esque. It's a little bit chaos, but the characters are wonderful, and I really enjoyed this series. Third book that I read this month, I finally read The Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wang. I read this on the plane to Ireland in early December, and I gotta tell you, this book is not what I was expecting it to be. People who have, who I've heard have like pitched this book online that like ultimately led to me wanting to read it, have compared it to Avatar: The Last Airbender, The Poppy War, books like that, and I have to say that this book was not like those. I do see the connection to Avatar: The Last Airbender just because there's like sort of elemental magic. Other than that, there was no connection between those things. I didn't think that it was like the Poppy War. I genuinely deeply cared about these characters, and I gotta tell you, halfway through I was up almost sobbing on the plane. That was the hardest I have ever worked to not cry. And I also have to say that the main character of this book is not who I thought the main character was going to be. And the book ended up not being about what I thought the book was going to be about. In the beginning, we meet the Matsuda family. We meet their son, Mamoru. I don't think I'm saying his name right. And he is going to school, and a new kid comes to school. And this new kid comes and challenges his ideals of what it means to live on the island of Kaigen, and to be the protector of this world. We follow his mom, Misaki. Again, I don't think I'm saying her name right. And I have to say, like, the story, it just was heart-wrenching. And it was a beautiful story about grief and war and how that drives people apart and can also bring them back together. Like, the writing was spectacular. It was a beautiful story, but it is not what I thought it was going to be. So if you're going into the Sword of Kaigen thinking that it's going to be like the Poppy War or like Avatar: The Last Airbender, it is not those things. I will say the battle scenes were so intense. Again, I was on the plane, like, reading on my Kindle and listening. I was doing like a co-read, and I was like, my mouth was hanging open at some of the battle scenes. It was incredibly well written, but it is not the story that I thought it was going to be. I highly recommend it. If that's something that sounds interesting to you, I highly recommend it. It was a great fantasy. The one downside to this is that it ends on a little bit of a cliffhanger. Well, not really a cliffhanger. The ending is kind of open. It left room for Emma Wang to write more books in this series, in this world, but unfortunately at the end of the book she says that she's not going to, that for the time being she is not going to be returning to this world. I think there are a few other books that are part of this world, but they're not on Kindle Unlimited, they're not on Amazon. I'm sure that you could get them from her personal website, but again, it's sort of like leaves it open, leaves you wanting more, but there's not going to be any more books for the foreseeable future. So that is a bummer. It is a standalone, and it can be read as a standalone, but the ending, I wanted more. The next book that I read, I actually like really love this, and I think about it every once in a while. It pops into my head. It's Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata. I think that's how you say their name. This was a really interesting story to me. It was like a slice of life of a woman in her 30s in Japan who works at a convenience store. And I thought this was so interesting. I feel like the main character is she's neurodivergent coded. And I just thought it was so interesting to hear her talk about how much she loved working at the convenience store, that it just felt right to her. And then the ending of the story, there was like a little twist where she meets somebody who is also sort of similar to her, but also very different. And I just thought this was a fascinating little slice of life novella. And it was a really great read. It is outside of my normal genre. It is not fantasy. I think it's lit fic. Again, it was very short, but it was a very well told slice of life story. I read The Bridge Kingdom by Danielle Jensen. What can I say about this book? One, it's not a unique story, okay? So if you're going into this thinking that it's going to be something new and something fresh, it's not. But I will say, out of all of the trashy fantasy romance books that I have read this year, this is one of the better ones. I think top tier fantasy romance is obviously One Dark Window and Two Twisted Crowns. I think those are spectacular fantasy romance. I read The Serpent and the Wings of Night earlier this year as well, and I thoroughly enjoyed those. Fantastic, great story, I'm not going to say well-crafted, great story, fantasy romance. This one is like slightly under. The story is not new, okay? It's about a princess who is trained her entire life to be a spy to the enemy kingdom, and she's married off to the enemy king in order to spy on him. And it turns out he has a wonderful man who is super hot and loves her. So it's not a new story. However, it was a very good story, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I ate it up. I think I read it in about 2 days. And it's not a small book. I think the audiobook was about 15 hours. It was really great. If you like fantasy romance and you have Kindle Unlimited or you have Audible, I really recommend checking out the audiobook or the ebook. It was a lot of fun, and it was a great palate cleanser after reading The Sword of Kaigen. I needed something a little bit lighter. Next, I read 2 short novellas. One is called Foster by Claire Keegan, and this is about a young girl in the Ireland countryside. I thought this was so appropriate to read on... I read it on the way home from Ireland. It's about a young girl in the Ireland countryside, and for a couple months, she goes to live with a family. She's fostered by another family. Her family, the one that, you know, her birth parents were obviously like very poor. They were struggling, and so another family offered to keep her for a couple of months over the summer. And again, it was just a really, really sweet story about found family. And it was like just a little slice of life of what I assume was Ireland in, I want to say, like the 50s or 60s. That was kind of the vibe. It was really sweet. The family who fostered her had lost their son a few years earlier, and they were just missing having a child in their home. And they were about the same age. And it made me cry. Again, I was on the plane trying not to cry. But it was just a beautiful story of found family. It was very short. I want to say it was about 100 pages. It was a great read for the plane. And the last book of the plane reads, I read An Elderly Lady is Up to No Good by Helene Turston. Now, I did not know when I started this, but this is kind of part of a series. It was pitched as a standalone, but I feel like I would have understood more if it had been part of a series. But it's about this old lady who's just going around and murdering people. Honestly, I was so there. I was here for it. I love stories about little old ladies murdering people, and that is not something that I knew about myself until I read this book. The audiobook was great. It was really short. It was about a 3-hour long audiobook, and it was it was a slice of life story, but it was a slice of life of an elderly murderer. Obviously, she's not murdering good people. She's murdering people who did her wrong or who were bad. But, whatever. It was funny. It was kind of silly. As silly as a book about murder can be. But I really enjoyed it. I also read The Traitor Queen by Danielle Jensen. This is book 2 in the Bridge Kingdom series. Again, nothing new in this book. It's not a new story. It's not anything different or out of the ordinary, but it was a really great follow-up to the Bridge Kingdom. We continued following our characters. At the end of the first book, obviously the love interests were separated, and this book brought them back together, and it was beautiful, and it was everything that you hoped it would be. There's 4 books in this series. The second 2 books, the first 2 books are about 2 characters. The 3rd and 4th books are about separate characters. And I started the 3rd book, but I just didn't want to read about those characters. So I'm going to take a little bit of a break from the series and then hopefully go back, because I have heard that books 3 and 4 are even better than 1 and 2. So fingers crossed that I will actually get to that in 2024. So one of the only books that I've read this month that I actually have a physical copy of is Starling House by Alix Harrow. In this book, we follow Opal. She is an older sister, and she is struggling to take care of her brother and keep her brother out of the foster care system because their mom died, and they are both kind of too young to be living on their own. But Opal is determined to help her brother get out of the town of Eden that they live in. She ends up getting a job at the Starling house doing some cleaning and stuff there. And that's kind of where the story really takes off. This was fine. Okay. This was a fine book. I feel like it read really YA, and it may be a YA. It read really young and it read really immature. I wish that there had been more about poverty and that sort of thing, and small towns in Kentucky. I wish that this had been more. I enjoyed the story, but again, I wish that there had been more to this. There was some female rage aspects of it that I enjoyed, but all in all, this was not a favorite book for me. I think it was fine. I am very glad that I have this gorgeous edition. Again, nothing really to write home about for this one. After that, I needed a little palate cleanser. And so I read The Demon's Bargain by Katee Robert. This is the 4th book in her monster romance series. The next book is coming out in a couple of months and I'm very excited to read it. I really enjoyed this book. I love that it was from Romanu's perspective. I feel like we always get little glimpses of Romanu, and I've really enjoyed when their character was on page, and I have always wanted a little bit more from those interactions, and Katee Robert gave that to us. This was sort of a novella for like a novella series, because all of these monster romance books are quite short, but this one was a little bit shorter. And what can I say? It was a monster romance. The second and last book that I read this month that I actually have a physical copy of is The Will of the Many by James Islington. This was incredible. I have not read much high fantasy this year. I've really been in my fantasy romance era, but this high fantasy was absolutely spectacular. The political scheming, okay? If you like political scheming and political intrigue and not being able to trust anyone except for your main character, this is the book for you. And honestly, like, the main character, like, I was absolutely rooting for him the whole time. This book follows Vis, who is an orphan and a prince. When the Empire came and took over his home, he was lucky to escape with his life. His whole family was murdered, and he has been living in an orphanage in secret ever since. And when a high up Senate person comes to his orphanage and adopts him and gives him a special task of infiltrating a very prestigious school, trying to find out what happened to the senator's brother. This was very Game of Thrones in that everybody is doing their own thing. They're all playing their own game. Granted, I have only seen the TV show Game of Thrones. I have not read the books. There was just a lot of moving parts in this, and it was so political. I loved that, and it kept me hooked. It did start to drag at around 70%, but then once the ending, like, this is what the book has been about this whole time, sort of started, I was immediately hooked again, and the last couple of pages blew my mind, okay? I cannot wait for the next books in this series. I am chomping at the bit for this. This was so good. The hype around this one is very real. This was very good. And it's a big book. It was like 600 pages, but it didn't feel like I was reading a 600-page book. So that was really nice. And the last book that I read this month was Mistlefoe by Kimberly Lemming. This was a short little novella for Kimberly Lemming's Mead Realm romances. And it was really cute. It was a nice little Christmas romp. There's a talking sword. I don't know what to say about these books. Kimberly Lemming is really giving us cozy romance, and she's doing a great job, and I cannot wait to read the next book in this series. That was everything that I read in December. It was a really great reading month for me and a really great reading year, and I'm so excited to continue reading with you all in January. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe. Subscribe to my channel, please. Gotta go. Bye.